time to reread it with some care, and I confess, and that's the right word, I confess to be so impressed with its accuracy, as well as its eloquence and more than occasional wit, and it's getting to the heart of the current enthusiasm for the theme of civility in our country, that I cannot do my duty as an academic, which is to say, to nip at the heels and find some grounds for contentious disagreement. I'm relegated to doing a kind of brief reprise and to hit, I hope, dead center of Orwin's remarks in the fewest number of words that I can muster. There might be some value in that. Orwin shows that at the core of Obama's image and self-image is the idea of empathy. He cites the contrast between empathy and compassion, which had sincerely characterized the aim of the Bush administration and the Clinton administration. In the case of Clinton, it had characterized his personal style as well. The contrast favors empathy. It's less squishy, more virile, less liable to treat its beneficiaries as clients and to transform them into dependents. Also, empathy makes a greater demand on oneself. It calls for a closer and cooler self-examination of one's own attitudes and aims. It is thus more in keeping with the demands of a self-governing citizenry. Nevertheless, Orwin does criticize. One can say that in the same admirable spirit of empathy for his subject, Orwin offers a tough-minded and cool-hearted criticism that is not veiled, nor does he pull his punches. The problem is that empathy can never really be anything more than a capacity, albeit a noble capacity at its best. Obama's attempts to elevate empathy to a principle, but it will not serve as a principle. An illustrative example is that empathy is something that we owe to our political opponents as we honestly try to understand their position from their point of view. It is in that way something that ties into or perhaps even equates with civility, the published topic of our seminar. At the same time, empathy, especially for the disadvantaged, is what informs the proper aim of public policy, thus defining the correct partisan posture. However, in this second mode, empathy appears to operate in the service and perhaps even to intensify the very partisanship that it wishes to moderate. The ultimate reason for this is that while empathy points in the right direction, the direction of justice, or at least a Kantian reciprocity, it is not equivalent to Kantian reciprocity. That is to say, the admonition of Obama's mother to ask oneself, how would you feel if someone did or said that to you, is not equivalent to the question, can the maxim that governs your action be willed by you to be a universal law, which many students in this room will recognize to be Kant's formulation of the categorical imperative. Empathy is more emotional than that. It's not equivalent to compassion, but it shares with compassion an acuteness towards the suffering of others, and therefore it tends towards policies that address themselves most directly to the amelioration of such suffering, that is, social welfare, progressive liberal policies. Now, to be sure, empathy in one of its modes demands a hearing from those who argue that such policies might be counterproductive. Orwin goes so far as to say that, and now I'm quoting Orwin, what distinguishes the free market economist from Mr. Obama is not less empathy for the poor, but a different interpretation of how the economy works. Well, maybe. In fact, yes. And yet, it is not less, it is the case that Milton Friedman's arguments about how best to respond to the problem of poverty requires a certain resistance to their claims, a certain hardening of the heart. A sober defense of capitalism requires admitting that capitalism looks, even feels, mean. All this being said, and it's hardly more than a reprieve on Orwin, the questions that remain for me are these. If Obama's rhetoric, policies, and whole presidency are to be judged by how far he moves the country towards a transpartisan politics, and is that desirable? Is it possible? But if so, could there be a nicer posture for an American Democratic president than to stand for the distinctive virtue of empathy? Fred.
Well, lucky you. You get to hear one more speech. And after you've been prepared for it by Professor Koratansky, I think you must assume that you're going to get a cross between Glenn Beck and the Grinch. But I'm not that at all. I'm a very nice guy. And I, first of all, have to start by saying I'm greatly honored to be on this platform, to be invited here by the Garfield Institute, and to be on this platform with two such excellent and renowned teachers and scholars. I got a long version and a short version of this. I thought probably we'd all be better off with a short one. Some of you may think that it's not short enough, but be that as it may. The increasing nastiness of American politics in the last few decades has given rise to much bemoaning of the lack of civility in our public discourse. A bipartisan organization calling itself No Labels was formed in order to elevate the character of our debates. Columnists like the Washington Post's E.J. Dionne have lamented the lack of civility, especially on the right. So the topic of this panel, civility, is very timely. Professor Orwin has brought before us a possible candidate for a new civility, President Obama's theme of empathy. It is of interest to him precisely because he finds in it something different from the subjective compassion which has been the contemporary substitute for civility, namely that it requires reciprocity, which civility necessarily involves. I'm afraid that I do not have a lot to say about empathy here. First, because I think that Professor Orwin does a splendid job of showing its inner weaknesses, if not its fundamental incoherence. Second, because like him, I am very dubious that it is in practice distinguishable from the politics of subjective compassion, which I will argue below is no substitute for civility at all. And third, because I see no sign that anyone, either President Obama or his followers, have followed up on the reciprocal element of empathy. When I consider in general Professor Orwin's development of the theme of empathy, I'm struck by its resemblance in some ways to one of those old Rube Goldberg machines that, he did tremendously complicated machinery to butter a piece of bread. And there was a variant of that, a kind of Dada variant, where the thing's job was to destroy itself. And that plus two more reasons, one of which I will spend a great deal of time on, one of which I'll just add at the very end, are reasons that I'm dubious about empathy as a new civility. The main one I'm going to talk about has to do, and here I'm going to sound a little bit Marxoid. I'm not a Marxist, I'm not even a Marxian, but this is going to be Marxoid. Namely, the class basis of civility. There is a class basis for it, and in short, we don't have it. To clear the ground, the current campaign for civility is no such thing, and here I may be somewhat uncivil. Exempting the bipartisan proponents of no labels, include my friend William Galston, our friend William Galston, it has shown itself to be nothing more than a tool to stereotype and demonize political opponents. Most of our current civilitarians have in fact made the cause of civility itself seem nothing other than a partisan talking point. Take a look at right-wing blogs today when the issue of civility arises. Nothing there but scorn and gloating about examples of leftist incivility and hypocrisy. The reason for this, of course, is that for the most part, this is a campaign of the left against the right, often grossly uncivil itself, as in the charges that the Tea Party caused the shooting of Congresswoman Gifford, and carried on by those like E.J. Dionne, who never said a word against the fearful incivility of his own side against Bush, Hitler, etc. To be credible in this sort of thing, one needs to have shown the ability to condemn one's own side before going on a mote and beam hunt against the other. And by and large, Krugman and Dion and company never did that. But maybe it doesn't matter. Perhaps the founders discovered in the structure of Madisonian interest group politics a way to dispense with civility. George Will's dyspeptic response to the No Labels effort seemed to assume that. He wrote a column about how this was just rough and tumble, vigorous American politics and butt out, you nice Nellies. Alas, for reasons I will state below, the founders did not. And Aristotle starts to explain why. Don't worry, in very brief. For Aristotle, human beings as rational creatures need to exercise their reason, which means deliberating with others. Free deliberation is only possible for free men, i.e. citizens. But deliberation is about matters involving interests, so it is likely rapidly to become passionate, dishonest, and even violent. Thus, willful men have to learn to control their passions and take seriously views they don't like. They need self-restraint, i.e. virtue. The boastful Homeric hero, I'm going to tear your legs off, I'm going to moiter you, has to become just and magnanimous, high-minded, ironic to his inferiors, and proud of his excellence, become the morally serious man, the spoudios. Civility is thus born in aristocracy. Pride is always restrained in civility, but it's always there. That's why it tends to be a very tense sort of thing, rather formal, rather ironic. It's an aristocratic virtue. It goes, if it even comes up again, it goes down and then comes up. If you replace the exercise of reason with interests as the fundamental guide to human well-being, as arguably the moderns did, it is possible to do without civility, but only if, a la Hobbes, you're also willing to do away with free government. With Locke, interests and free government are joined, and civility again becomes necessary as a check on passion. Fortunately, Locke produced a gentleman to match the need of Lockean politics, and it's best described in Locke's book on education. But the roots of this kind of aristocracy, I think, are in the origins of political realism, in the protracted negotiations that led to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which brought the wars of religion to an end. After the long sufferings that were produced by the usual combination of partisan fanaticism and cynical self-interest, perhaps best viewed in the career of Cardinal Richelieu, the leaders of Western Europe finally came back to the old principle that had been tried but failed to stick a century earlier of cuius regio, eius religio, his region, his religion, i.e., respect sovereignty, and so let already the prince pick the religion of his people. In this distaste for a feverish idealism that had brought nothing but human misery, a new kind of aristocracy, a little chastened, a little moderate, a little cynical, starting to become enlightened, was born. The 18th century gentleman was to be a worldly fellow indeed. His father would have taken him to a bordello and a gambling hell, lest he unknowingly fall into profligacy, and he was, of course, going to be too rational to fall into it knowingly. Like Voltaire, he will thus refuse his invitation to a second orgy on the sound basis of once a philosopher, twice a libertine. He will not have the lofty, old aristocratic disdain that refuses to dignify vice even by noticing it. Think of Katharine Hepburn in The African Queen. He may even be rather up on vice, but always with an aloof and itself disdainful irony. But that disdain will necessarily, to some degree, include himself. There are many examples to choose from in literature and history. Frederick the Great comes to mind, especially Nietzsche's account of him. But perhaps Jane Austen's Mr. Bennet is the best for our purposes, especially because Austen, whether her viewpoint is more Aristotelian or, as Lionel Trilling suggested, more Rousseauian, is quite direct about his flaws. For such an aristocracy is necessarily somewhat decadent. It lacks the primitive enthusiasm of the Homeric or Icelandic hero. And here I am reminded of a remark by another friend of ours, Professor Nathan Tarkov of the University of Chicago, that no one in the Iliad seemed to him to have a mental age of above 16. And this kind of gentleman even lacks the moral earnestness of Aristotle's Spudaios, and Pachikar liveth, whether or not there can be a Christian gentleman, he's not that either. The new aristocrat is a rather flip fellow whose serious sense of duty is masked by a pose of cynicism. Civility, as you might expect, is this man's middle name. It may be, as elsewhere in Jane Austen, a somewhat cold and disdainful civility. It may suffer from the insincerity that Rousseau so sharply criticized in the Lettres d'Alembert, but it is recognizably civility in all its forms. There is a classical American political formulation of this, and here I think by ignorance I'm probably poaching on your turf because I didn't know that you'd written about the Federalist and civility. I should have. It can be found in the First and Second Federalist Papers, where it states the case and the grounds for an appropriately wised-up American form of political civility. A great deal of Hamilton's introduction in the papers consists in the treatment of the question of malign motives, for among the most formidable of the obstacles which the new Constitution will have to encounter may readily be distinguished the obvious interest of a certain class of men in every state to resist all changes which may hazard a diminution of the power, emolument, and consequence of the offices they hold under the state establishments, and the perverted ambition of another class of men who will either hope to aggrandize themselves by the confusions of their country, or will flatter themselves with fairer prospects of elevation from the subdivision of the empire into several partial confederacies. So far, nothing for today's partisans to wonder at, except perhaps the elegance of the prose. But then Hamilton says he doesn't want to dwell upon observations of this nature. Indeed, it would be disingenuous to do so, because candor will oblige us to admit that even such men may be actuated by upright intentions, and they just may be wrong on the merits. This circumstance, if duly attended to, would furnish a lesson of moderation to those who are ever so persuaded of their being in the right in any controversy. And then the crucial point, the one that contemporary civilitarians usually miss. And a further reason for caution in this respect might be drawn from the reflection that we are not always sure that those who advocate the truth are influenced by purer principles than their antagonists. Our side, too, has its bad motives. Thus, were there not even these inducements to moderation, nothing could be more ill-judged than that intolerant spirit which at all times characterized political parties. As Federalist 51 more famously puts it, we're no angels. So let's have our fights while keeping that in mind. John Jay in Federalist 2 echoes this line of thought. He hopes the Constitution will get sedate and candid consideration, but observes that this is rather more to be wished than expected. Human beings are, for the Federalist, neither demonic miscreants nor saints. It sees our flaws honestly, but ruefully, without indignation, and yet urges us to try to surmount them. Civility here is still based on a kind of virtue, a kind of conscious self-restraint, but one that is induced by a certain relaxation, a certain acceptance of one's baseness. Here, the preacher of civility can be even-handed without prophetic indignation. He can be down on the gutter with the rest of us, but at least be open about it. But the Lockean gentleman, even in his final manifestations, say in Humphrey Bogart's Sam Spade or Casablanca Rick, was turned into cultural debris in the enthusiasms of the 1960s. Today's urbane, professional, academic, liberal successors of my parents' generation of friends who still bore traces of that self-ironic gentlemanliness are as pious moralists as any who griped about the laxness of the Treaty of Westphalia. So again, maybe Democrats don't need civility. Maybe a cool and rational politics of interests will suffice. After all, couldn't Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill denounce each other publicly and have drinks privately? But politics is really not beanbag, and sometimes we don't feel like conviviality with our enemies after the brawl is over. After all, the balance of interest depends largely on what those interests are, and that depends upon what we think they are. What people fight about are not always real restraints, or real interests, but perceived interests. And when there is no longer any strong tradition of emotional self-restraint, those perceived interests begin to change and move into the realm of melodrama, especially as the conflicts sharpen or the issues at stake become more urgent. Interest group politics may be the form and the arena of conflict, but the content can rapidly become theological and Manichaean at that. When that happens, the definition of interests undergoes such a change that ultimately you don't have a politics of interest at all, but one of identity. Where this can lead is instructively demonstrated by the futile negotiations for an Arab-Israeli peace in the form of a two-state solution. The recent WikiLeaks, as published by The Guardian in order to berate the Palestinian leadership for insufficient obstinacy, contain a passage in which Saeb Erekat, the Palestinian negotiator, is cited sarcastically rejecting the possibility of Jews remaining in a new Palestinian state. He appeals to his Palestinian DNA to explain how impossible it is for him to concede on this point. Thus, his very identity requires him to be unyielding. That is, the possibility of a compromise is ruled out for existential reasons from the outset. And it's not as if we don't have our own politics of racial, gender, or cultural identity. If then one cannot simply trust the arrangement of interest incentives to classic Madisonian politics, civility remains a desideratum of free government. In order to find a possible basis for it in our times, it might be worthwhile to look more carefully at the causes of the defects of many of the current appeals. Of course, for the Dions and the Krugmans, it is a rather elegant stick to beat a dog. But I think there is more to it than that. American liberals typically believe of themselves that they are rational, educated, open-minded, and fair. Their identity, perhaps fortunately for everyone, is tied up with notions of decent behavior. That they can behave with considerable indecency in the cause of decency should, however, not be surprising. That is, one side of our political tug-of-war, or rather important and leading elements within it, has aristocratic ambitions, if not pretensions. They see themselves as what in the Middle Ages called itself, even when in the minority, the sanior et melior pars, the saner and better part. And they understand that this requires them to stand up for civility. But in fact, they, and here I'm going to say we, at least including me, I don't know about the other two, are not aristocrats at all, but prosperous members of the bourgeoisie who want to think well of ourselves. We have neither the habits of self-restraint, nor the education that produces such habits, nor the deep self-confidence of either of the earlier forms of gentlemen. To put it in the terms of the title of Iris Murdoch's fine novel on the subject, The Nice and the Good, we believe in being nice, and we think that's the same as being good, which it's not. At the heart of the difference between the nice and the good is whether one is paying attention to the actual situation or how one feels about it and how one looks to others. The bourgeois, perpetually anxious, ever since Molière's Monsieur Jourdain, is deeply concerned with the latter. Politics, therefore, is far more a matter of personal confession, of image, of expression of one's idea of oneself, or how one would like to be thought of, than a direct response to situations. The tendency of the progressive left to be able to sympathize with anti-progressive causes, such as Islamic fundamentalism, has much, I think, to do with the understanding of politics as a kind of moral fashion, of being witnessed by others to bearing witness oneself, rather than as something that directly affects reality. But the bourgeois imitation of aristocracy is not just by means of bourgeois anxiety. There is the heritage of a liberalized, secularized Protestantism written all over its innocent, proudly multicultural face. But, and not utterly separately, remember Rousseau was born in Geneva, its deeper character is Romanticism. From Rousseau on, Romanticism has been one way that Democrats can stay Democrats and still have room for aristocratic sensibilities and even responsibilities. Werther, Europe learned, was a finer fellow than those soulless aristocrats around him. Instead of duty, the dialectical obverse of aristocratic privilege, which justifies that privilege, even if only by rationalization, instead now you get noble feelings, which are the dialectical obverse of selfish money-making. It is the aristocratic claim of the commercial classes. Instead of virtue, this morality trades in compassion, a subject no one has understood better than Professor Orwin himself. Of course, compassion means putting yourself in the other's place. It is thus rooted in one's feelings, and ultimately, in most cases, it is about those feelings, and it is about expressing those feelings. The repression of feeling that civility requires, I hate you, would you like to have some tea, is seen now as cold and inauthentic. Morality is about being a good person who has good feelings and expresses them honestly. And for the privileged, compassion obviously means solidarity with victims, so overt enemies may only be victims, the victims of those without compassion, thus the real enemy is other uncompassionate Americans. Further, righteous indignation directed at the unworthy is, of course, part and parcel of the practice of compassion. The prophet pities, but he also denounces. And in his righteous indignation, he easily gives vent to invective, which its objects, however unjustly, may find uncivil. Thus, the one-sided civility campaign from the left is not merely partisan or hypocritical. The angry cries of the oppressed and their protectors are not at all, to those who utter them, like the cynical or fanatical incivility of their oppressors. Whatever the truth of all this, it's no recipe for reciprocal civility. Again, civility requires the control of pride. Compassion appears on the surface to dispense with pride altogether, but in fact it releases that pride in an altered and in some way dialectically opposite form. Righteous indignation. Well, we are not Aristotelian or even Lockean gentlemen, and we're quite unlikely to produce many of those anytime soon. And if the kind of moralism we tend to deal in, even in the putative name of civility, is too exalted in its sentiments, not to say in narcissism, to have room for actual civility, what, if any, are the possible sources of a real renewal of civility? Yes, the increasing public disgust for the excessiveness of partisanship and the gradual discovery that we are in real trouble economically could help. But the felt need for something, like, say, democracy, has never been sufficient for producing it. Look at the history of Latin America or the Middle East. One needs other enabling conditions. When it comes to civility, do we have any of them? I've overstayed my welcome, so I will briefly suggest the following. I can imagine a politics of sober honesty, blunt, straightforward, even feisty, along the lines of the Democratic former mayor of New York, Edward Koch, or the Republican governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, that might, in its graceless toughness, actually force its opponents into some kind of reciprocity for fear of appearing hypocritical. It would mean, above all, a politics of honesty, of admitting, for instance, the downsides of whatever policies one was recommending. It would break conventional political rules and be a counterintuitive politics that is only usually effective in hard times when people are afraid that flattery conceals irresponsibility and consequent danger. That is, it just might be right for our times. The particular example I would cite is of the aforementioned Mayor Koch. After a particularly shocking murder in an outer New York borough and under vehement attack at a public meeting for assigning insufficient police to the neighborhood, he bluntly told his constituents that, given needs and resources, he simply couldn't justify giving them more police. Amazingly, he turned out not to have gaffed, but to have gained trust and respect for his candor. By apparently showing his neck to his executioners, by exercising some of Hamilton's candor, he in fact made himself less vulnerable. By trusting the ultimate good sense of the people, i.e. by going against all the cynical wisdom of the pols and the academics, he made his high-flown and indignantly moralistic opponents seem silly. The point here I want to make, abandoning the text, is above all, the birth of civility, the rebirth of civility, is going to take something they call in Europe civil courage. It's going to take guts. Koch took a risk. He could have looked really terrible having said that. Cold, insensitive, harsh. Yeah? Had President Obama, for instance, at some point said, you know, I campaigned against Bush's Guantanamo policy and against the war in Afghanistan, but you know what? Damn it. I was wrong. He was right. This is what we got to do. If he'd said that once, if he'd taken that political risk, the prospects for civility, I think, would be infinitely better than they are with a lot of general talk about empathy. This does not, by the way, mean that something could not be made by Professor Orwin or by better and greater politicians than the ones we've got out of empathy. The points he makes in its favor abstractly, I think, are very good. But I think what is needed first is a kind of generous disarming of oneself that takes a lot of guts. As America becomes ever more democratic and ever less aristocratic, which to exercise some of the candor I have called for means ever more vulgar and ever less refined, it seems to me that the aristocratic virtues that are necessary for free government need to find an ever lower basis. Perhaps brutal honesty will do for now. Its success would depend on the morale of the non-political classes, the vast majority of the country. If that morale is low, angry demagogues will carry the day, and we will suffer the usual disastrous results. If it is high, and the people are ready to get serious about our problems, it might not so much produce a culture of civility as make seem absurd the more usual forms of contemporary incivility. But I don't think myself that much has been done by the elites, by the political classes in recent decades, and I've been trashing the left, but let me include the right in this as well, to cultivate the conditions of high citizen morale for the public. To the contrary, if the American people still can face realities calmly and with true civility, it is not much to the credit of its recent leaders, and above all of most of those who set themselves up to teach them manners. Thank you.